The neighborhood was supposed to be a peaceful place, a haven where families could live without unnecessary troubles. That's exactly what I thought when I first moved in. The houses were beautiful, the lawns well kept, and the streets clean. Everything seemed perfect. But what I didn't know was that behind this picture-perfect scenery, a tyrant ruled. At first, I barely noticed her. She was just another neighbor, someone I occasionally saw walking her dog or chatting with others in the community. But as time passed, her presence became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just any neighbor, she was the head of the homeowners association, and she carried that title like a crown. She made the rules and she made sure everyone followed them. No exceptions, no discussions, no mercy. I remember the first letter. It was taped to my door, written in bold letters as if I had committed a crime. Apparently, my trash bin was left out a few minutes past the allowed time. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a simple misunderstanding. After all, how much trouble could a trash bin cause? But the letters didn't stop. Every few weeks, a new notice appeared. One time it was about the color of my front door. Another time it was about the flowers I planted near my porch. None of these things seemed like a real problem, but to her, they were violations, serious ones. I tried to comply. I really did. I changed the flowers, repainted the door, and even set alarms to remind myself to bring in the trash bin exactly on time. But nothing was ever enough. She always found something else. It felt like she had made me her personal project, determined to break me down one rule at a time. Then came the fines. At first, they were small. $25 for a yard maintenance issue even though my grass was freshly cut, $50 for excessive decorations, when all I had was a single welcome mat. I thought it was ridiculous, but I paid them just to avoid further trouble. Then the amounts increased. One day, I received a notice stating that I owed $500 for repeated violations. Violations I didn't even understand. That's when I knew this wasn't just about rules. It was about control. I decided to confront her. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe I could reason with her. I knocked on her door, rehearsing my words in my head, trying to keep my emotions in check. When she answered, her expression told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't interested in reasoning. She wasn't interested in fairness. She smiled, an insincere, smug smile that made my stomach turn. "It's all in the HOA regulations," she said, leaning against the doorway like she had all the power in the world. "You agreed to the rules when you moved in." I told her the fines were unfair. I told her that I had done everything she asked, but she barely listened. Instead, she smirked. "If you can't follow the rules, maybe this neighborhood isn't for you." That sentence stuck with me. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. She wasn't just trying to enforce regulations, she was trying to push me out. I walked away, furious but determined. I wasn't going to let her bully me out of my own home. But things got worse. The fines didn't stop. Notices started arriving almost daily, some for violations I hadn't even committed. Then, the worst of it all, I received a notice stating that the HOA was considering legal action against me for persistent noncompliance. My stomach dropped. Was that even possible? Could they really take me to court over this nonsense? I felt powerless. She had the entire HOA board under her thumb, and they backed every decision she made without question. Complaints from other homeowners were ignored or dismissed. She had turned what was supposed to be a community into her personal kingdom, and anyone who challenged her authority suffered the consequences. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the latest letter. My hands were shaking, not just with anger but with frustration. This was my home. I had worked hard to live here, to build a life here. And now, because of one woman's power trip, I was being treated like a criminal. I needed help. Real help. This wasn't just a petty argument anymore. It was war. And if she wanted a fight, I was ready to give her one. That's when I decided to call my lawyer. I sat in my car, gripping the latest HOA notice in my hands, my heart pounding with frustration. Another violation. Another fine. This time, they claimed my mailbox was not in compliance with community aesthetics. It was the exact same mailbox that had been there since I moved in. The exact same design everyone else had. I knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. I had hoped that after my last conversation with the HOA head, she would back off. Maybe she'd realize I wasn't someone she could bully into submission. But instead she doubled down. The notices came faster, the fines got bigger, and the accusations became more absurd. It felt like she was watching my house every second, waiting for the smallest excuse to hit me with another violation. One morning I stepped outside to find a tow truck parked in front of my driveway. Confused, I rushed over only to find that they were hooking up my car. My car. In my own driveway. What the hell are you doing? I demanded. The driver barely looked at me. Order from the HOA, he muttered, handing me a slip of paper. I snatched it from his hand, my fingers trembling as I read it. Unauthorized vehicle parked on residential property. My own car, parked in my own driveway, was somehow an unauthorized vehicle? This is a mistake, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You can't just tow my car. The driver shrugged. Take it up with the HOA. And just like that, my car was gone. I stormed to the HOA office, my blood boiling. I wasn't going to let this go. I threw open the door and marched straight to her desk. She looked up with that same smug smile, as if she had been expecting me. Ah, she said, tilting her head. I was wondering when you'd come by. I slammed the violation notice on her desk. This is insane. You had my car towed from my own driveway. She leaned back in her chair, completely unfazed. It was an eyesore. Residents complained. My jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. That's a lie and you know it. She shrugged. Rules are rules. That was her answer for everything. Rules are rules. As if that gave her the right to make my life a nightmare. I wanted to scream, to tell her exactly what I thought of her power trip. But I knew that's what she wanted, to push me to the edge, to make me snap so she could paint me as the problem. I turned and walked out, my hands shaking with rage. This wasn't just about rules. This was about control. She wanted me gone. And she was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. But I wasn't going anywhere. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the mountain of notices and fines spread out before me. My savings were draining fast, and if this kept up, I'd be drowning in HOA fees. I had tried everything, complying, reasoning, even ignoring, but none of it worked. She wasn't going to stop until I gave up. A knot formed in my stomach as I realized what I had to do. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the number I had been avoiding. A lawyer. The last thing I wanted was a legal battle, but I had no choice. She wasn't playing fair, so neither could I. The next day I walked into the law office, my fists clenched at my sides. I had no idea what to expect, but the moment I sat down across from my lawyer, I felt a flicker of hope. He listened carefully as I explained everything, the notices, the fines, the ridiculous violations. And as I spoke, his expression shifted from curiosity to something else. Something sharper. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. This isn't just HOA enforcement, he said finally. This is harassment. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Harassment. I had thought I was just being singled out, that maybe I was overreacting. But hearing him say it so plainly made everything click. She's targeting you specifically, he continued. And from what you've told me, she's breaking more rules than she's enforcing. I let out a shaky breath. So, what do we do? A slow smile spread across his face. We fight back. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I wasn't powerless. Maybe she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. I had tried playing by the rules, but now it was time to play by hers. Only this time I wasn't alone. And she had no idea what was coming. The moment my lawyer took over, everything changed. The fear, the helplessness, it all started to fade. He wasn't just confident, he was relentless. He told me exactly what we needed to do, and for the first time I felt like I had a real chance at fighting back. The first step was gathering proof. We needed to show that this wasn't about HOA rules, it was about her personal vendetta against me. I spent days collecting every notice, every fine, every ridiculous violation she had thrown my way. My lawyer helped me draft official requests for HOA records, financial statements, and board meeting notes. If she had been unfairly targeting me, the paper trail would expose her. And it did. What we found was worse than I had imagined. She wasn't just abusing her power, she was profiting from it. My lawyer discovered that several of the fines she issued, including the ones she had given me, weren't properly documented in the HOA's financial reports. Where was that money going? No one knew. Or rather, no one wanted to admit knowing. The more we dug, the clearer the pattern became. She had a history of targeting specific homeowners, slapping them with endless fines, and then conveniently offering a way out, selling their home. And guess who had connections with local real estate investors? She did. It wasn't just about power. It was a business. She was pushing people out, lowering property values, and making a profit on the back end. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just my fight anymore. She had done this to others, families, elderly residents, people who didn't have the resources to push back. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for everyone she had bullied. My lawyer wasted no time. He drafted a formal complaint, outlining every unethical and potentially illegal action she had taken. We weren't just going to take this to the HOA board. We were taking it to court. When she received the legal notice, her reaction was immediate. That smug, untouchable confidence she had always carried? It was gone. She stormed into the HOA office, demanding to know who had dared to challenge her authority. But for once, people weren't afraid. The moment she saw me sitting there with my lawyer, her face turned red with rage. "You think you can come after me?" she spat, her voice sharp and filled with venom. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." My lawyer didn't flinch. "Actually," he said smoothly, placing the stack of evidence on the table, "we know exactly who we're dealing with." She glanced at the documents and for the first time I saw it: fear. We weren't just accusing her of unfair fines. We had evidence of financial misconduct, selective enforcement, and legal violations that could dismantle her entire operation. She knew it, and for the first time she had no way out. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal action. She tried to fight back, throwing counterclaims and threats, but the more she pushed, the deeper she sank. Other homeowners started coming forward, sharing their own experiences. People she had intimidated were finally speaking up. The community, the very people she had ruled over with an iron fist, were turning against her. And then the final blow. A state investigation was launched into the HOA's financial practices. The missing money, the shady real estate deals, it was all coming to light. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, but now she was scrambling to save herself. I watched as she walked into the courtroom, her arrogance replaced with panic. She barely looked at me, barely acknowledged anyone. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but there was nothing left to say. She had built her power on fear and deception, and now, it was all crumbling around her. The moment the judge spoke, delivering the verdict, I felt something I hadn't in months. Relief. Not just for myself but for everyone she had wronged. She had spent years making people feel small, making them believe they had no power. But in the end, it wasn't fear that won. It was justice. And as she walked out, defeated and disgraced, I knew one thing for sure. She would never be able to do this to anyone ever again. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the weight that had been crushing me for months finally started to lift. The air felt lighter, the world a little brighter. I had spent so long living under her thumb, so long feeling like I was trapped in a battle I could never win. But now she was the one who had lost. The news spread fast. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact when she walked by were now talking openly, sharing their own stories, their own frustrations. It was like a spell had been broken. People weren't afraid anymore. They weren't whispering in fear of being the next target. They were angry. A few days after the verdict, I received a call from one of my neighbors. He had lived here for years, long before she took over the HOA. His voice was lighter than I had ever heard it. "She's gone," he said. "Resigned this morning." I sat there for a moment, letting the words sink in. She had ruled this neighborhood like a queen, making decisions without question, treating homeowners like peasants under her control. And now she was gone. But her departure didn't mean the fight was over. The damage she had done still lingered. The board members who had blindly followed her were scrambling, trying to distance themselves, pretending they had never been a part of it. The financial mess she left behind was still being investigated. The people who had lost money, lost their homes. Justice for them was still in motion. Then came the letters. Not from the HOA but from neighbors. Handwritten notes, emails, messages from people I barely knew. Some were simple: "Thank you for standing up." Others told stories that made my stomach turn. Elderly couples who had been harassed into selling their homes, young families who had drained their savings to pay off endless fines, people who had moved away just to escape her wrath. I thought about how close I had come to giving up, how many nights I had stared at those violation notices and wondered if it was even worth it. If I had just paid the fines, just stayed quiet, maybe she would have left me alone eventually. But that's the thing about bullies. They don't stop when you give in. They stop when they're forced to. A few weeks later, the HOA held a meeting, the first one in years where people actually showed up willingly. This time, there were no threats, no smug smiles from the head of the table. The board members were quiet, nervous. They knew what was coming. The community wasn't just here to listen. They were here to take back control. One by one, homeowners stood up and spoke. They shared their experiences, their frustrations, their anger. And then the votes were cast. A new board. A fresh start. No more dictatorship, no more abuse of power. Just a community finally free to be what it was meant to be. As I walked home that night, I saw things I hadn't noticed before. Neighbors chatting in their yards, kids playing without parents nervously glancing at their doors, people laughing, really laughing, for the first time in a long time. It wasn't just my victory. It was everyone's. And as I stepped onto my porch, looking at the home I had fought so hard to keep, I realized something. She had tried to make me feel small, powerless, insignificant. But in the end I was never alone. And I never would be again.